All right. What is up? What is up? Welcome to Startup Shop Talk,
What up,
everyone. My name
folks?
is Josh David Miller. I'm here with my buddy Dan Cassis-Murray. Dan, how are you?
I'm pretty good. How are you doing?
I am exceedingly well, thank you. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Yeah. So tell me, what do you got? What's the new year got in store for you?
Well, I don't know. I'm still kind of in that the ebb, right? So what I really like is like from December to January, there's always this the holidays, like everybody's all like super geared up and everything like that, right? And then the holidays come and then there's this lull. And depending on what your job is, depending on what you're doing, you get that lull, it gets a little played out a little bit more. So in my line of work, what I'm doing right now, sort of just waiting for folks to get back into their routines and their schedules and everything. So I'm still in the lull and I'm kind of digging it.
Well, that's great. That's great. Sometimes that little downtime is like rejuvenating, right? Which
Yeah. That
yeah, there's
whole,
like a
what are you going to say?
I was going to say there's like a whole rebirth thing that comes with new days, new months, and definitely new years, right? Where we want to
Oh
feel
yeah.
that like here we are.
I mean, if there's one thing that like I've experienced, like, and I'm just more in touch with, it's the ebb and flow of things and how cycles exist and how patterns actually kind of show us where those cycles are, where you're at in the cycle and all
Right,
that other kind of
right.
stuff.
Totally, totally.
So what
Yeah,
about
that
you?
makes like my brain is awash in new ideas,
Oh,
right? Because it's the
damn.
beginning of the year and I can't help myself. It's just like that's just
Yeah.
where we are, right?
Yeah.
We are absolutely just like in this time where we're starting anew. And even though we're not, right? Like 2020, 2021, hard years. And I feel like we all need this reset, right? And so like
Hmm.
we have to have this optimism and all that going into it. So that's why I'm really excited because like because of our topic today, right?
Yeah.
But
Although
before
I was going to say, although 2021 seemed optimistic in the beginning.
it
So, right? Like everybody was like, yeah, 2020 is over. And
well, I think
2021 was like, guess what?
yeah, that was folly. That was folly. All right. This time it's real. All right. Don't crush my optimism. Don't rain on my parade.
It's
We're
real,
here for
bro.
good.
It's real.
I'm curious, like, I'm curious for those of you out there, like, are you a startup founder? What are you working on? What brings you here today? Throw down in the comments. Tell us what you're working on. We'd love to hear about it. That'd be pretty cool.
And even if
But
you're not
welcome.
a startup founder, are you wanting to be a startup founder or are you thinking about being one?
Totally. Yes.
Yeah.
We're inclusive of the entire spectrum because this is Startup Shop Talk, our weekly live show all about startups from idea to product market fit. And our philosophy here is how do you eat an elephant? You eat it one bite at a time. So come on over and let us help you take bites of that apple. Join the conversation. It's gonna be fun. Today's show is all about creativity through constraints, right?
That
How
sounds nice. And
counterintuitively
I was just going to say that sounds nice and counterintuitive.
it is, right? Because we think about this idea of freedom, but we're going to get
Uh-huh.
back to that in just a minute, right? Let's do some brief introductions. Let's see who the heck we talking about here. So Dan, I know you, but our folks out in YouTube land may not know you. Who are you?
All right. So don't let the fake ass background and the ponytail fool you, or you could let it fool you. It doesn't matter. So basically, I'm a professional right now. I'm a professional student slash teacher, which means basically I love learning about stuff and I love talking about what I've learned and sharing that with other people. I am a business owner. I have co-founded a company before, and well, now what I do is I help folks with this one nasty question that was a total showstopper for me, and was the source of many failed ventures. And that was, how do you get customers? I've taken some time to learn how to apply like what's in those lean startup books, the business model canvas, all the frameworks and all that kind of stuff, and been like, okay, well, this is all great, but if I don't have customers, how the hell am I going to implement this? how's that gonna work? And you know,
Right,
for a while
right.
it was like, wait a minute, you're talking about do this with the customers and do that with the customers. I'm like, where are the customers? Is there a store? No, there's not a store. I got to find those. So once I figured that out, I was like, oh, okay. Flash of the blinding obvious, but it's hard. It's hard work. What up, Laura? And anyways, that's what I do. Is I share my experience and what I've learned with others, so that they don't have to sit there and scratch their heads and feel like that aloneness of not, like, feeling like everybody's getting it, but I don't get it, and so what's wrong with me, kind of thing. There's nothing wrong with you.
Right,
It's
right.
just that the books haven't told you that. So I'm here to tell you that. So that's what I do. That's who I am.
Oh, fantastic. For those who don't know me, my name is Josh David Miller. I am a professional instigator by day and a content creator by night, and I specialize in the metacognition of innovation and entrepreneurship. That's how to thinking about those topics. I volunteer as a startup ecosystem builder here in Sacramento, where my buddy Dan and I are located. I facilitate startup competitions, venture conferences, and all that kind of stuff. I'm also the local organizer of our 1 Million Cups chapter, and Laura, who we just said hello to, is also one of our organizers, as is Dan. So definitely check that out, because you can find me there every single Wednesday morning asking founders tough questions, but out of love. Right? Out of love. I am also the founder of The Right Box, which helps startups and corporate innovators unlock growth and scale. If you want to hunt me down, you can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn at Josh D. Miller. That's kind of where
a
I
sick
am.
bird, bro.
That's just a little emoji bird. I decided to drop in there. So we're good with that. Welcome to today's episode. We're going to talk all about creativity and constraints and ideation, because of that new year and new hope, right? We're going to focus a lot on that. And so the best place to start here is about this idea of freedom through constraints, right? Freedom through constraints. I want to talk about what that means, because that seems pretty counterintuitive. It seems like, well, wait a minute here. Like, we're always told, think outside the box and do all this. And now you're like trying to shackle me and say that that's going to make me creative. No, I need
You're taking away my fun.
Taking away my fun. An artist starts with a blank canvas, right? But it's not, because, like, let's say what's wrong with freedom, right? We always tell everybody it's time. Oh, you got to think outside the box, right? That's how you innovate. That's how you get creative. You think outside the box. The problem with that advice is, let's say you're even able to do it, right? Because the box is the sum of all of our values and all of the decisions that we've made to get to this point, right? That's our box. And so, yeah, we do have to think outside that box. That's true, right? Or we're just going to do everything how we've always done it, which is neither creative nor innovative. But the problem is, then what? Like, we're outside the box. Now what do we do? Right? That's because that advice of thinking outside the box only tells us what not to do. It doesn't tell us what to do. So it's like getting airdropped blindfolded in the middle of a forest and told, like, find your way out. What do we do?
I can relate to that feeling.
Right?
Yeah, like, sometimes, it's like, okay, well, wait a minute. Sometimes I have too many options, right? Like, here's a thing that I want to work on. Like, I want to work in the air conditioning industry. Like, what are the things that I can do? Or even maybe even a better one is okay, I'm in school and somebody's got, actually, the worst question that I've ever been asked in my life is, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Why is that?
I have no idea. I mean, I just gotta, like, pick one thing. Come on. I mean, there's, like, a lot of different things that I could be, right? And sometimes it helps to know, like, what my limitations are and what, of course, my parents meant well, and everybody means well when they say, hey, we're talking about aspirations and everything like that. But man, as a little kid, 8, 10, 12 years old, not knowing, I don't know, a firefighter, an astronaut, some shit like that, right?
Right.
No. What if I told them, hey, you know what I want to do? I want to fail at a bunch of startups, and I want to teach other people how not to fail. That, I mean, come on, right? Like, that's not necessarily a career. That's not a thing. But I have found that gives my life way more meaning than telling people that, I fly around in, like, imaginary rocket ships and shit.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
So
Yes. Or you could just be like Laura and you could think outside the circle. Like that's fine. That's fine too. You know, that totally works. But so right. So like once we're like outside that void, like we need something to tell us what direction to walk in, right? When we're like airdropped in the forest, like we need to know what to do. And that's another way of describing a constraint. And so we're going to talk about some of those constraints and how you can use those constraints to create ideas. But you need something to do that. The other reason we need it is constraints help us suppress our inner critic, right? We've got this little voice inside us all the time that's saying that's a bad idea, right? Something pops in your head, you go, nope, that's a bad idea, right? And a lot of times that's really helpful, right? So if you think back, you know, to us like on the African savannah and, you know, our ancestors on the African savannah, and like you're thinking like there's a tiger down there, I could jump down from this tree right now. Probably a terrible idea, right? And so you do need something to suppress that internal critic. But when we're trying to do something that goes against our experience, which creativity and innovation do, that internal critic can actually be harmful. Not because it's wrong most of the time. It's actually right most of the time. But the times that it's wrong are where we're going to find the really good ideas, right? So we want to suppress our internal critic. So that's really important. That's kind of our theme here today. So I'm curious, as we start to talk about these, what are some tricks that you guys use right now to help think outside the box? How do you do that right now? What are some of your tools, tips, techniques that you do? Throw those down in the comments. Love to hear what you guys are like applying in your world, what we start to talk about some of ours. And so I think it's time, Dan. I think we got to start talking about like what we mean when we say constraints, right? Like we got to talk about like, okay, so what is, when we say like, okay, yeah, we have these, you know, these constraints, like what exactly are we talking about? So I want to throw up a couple of like some common examples of design constraints that we've got going on here. So what are some of the constraints you use, Dan? Like what are some of the common constraints you kind of lean on when you want to be creative?
Well, let's see. A lot of times I will start with input constraints. In fact, I mostly start with input constraints, right? So as an ideator, as somebody that is a content creator, somebody that like needs to solve problems for other people, like whether that's implementing systems or whether that's co-founding something else, right? I always am aware of the fact that I can sit here with my whiteboards and come up with a lot of cool stuff, right? Sticky notes everywhere, just like lines and red string and all that stuff. But I need direction and guidance. And a lot of the times I find that my customers or the people that are the ones who I want to serve, right? The ones that may be my customers, once I find out what it is they need help with, that serves to really focus stuff in. And so input constraints are one of those things that I really love starting with because they really help to narrow down the options. So I have like some things to think about. Kind of like I was watching this YouTube video once about this architect, and I was looking at a design thing, right? And this person has designed some really great buildings, really great looking structures. And in the video, he said one of the first things that he does is he looks, okay, where's gravity? What's the land look like? Where does the sun rise? Where does the sun set? What are the things that I have to work with? Like, where's the water? All the things, right? And he's like, in that basically allows me to understand, okay, what am I dealing with? What do I need to work with so that I can implement creative solutions in these other places? And I was like, man, it's one of those, I knew it, but I didn't know that I didn't know it, you
Right.
know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, totally. No, that's great. I love that.
So
And
input
like,
constraints, basically, those are my favorites.
yeah, and so that's
Always
like a
start with
great,
that.
like since you're talking about in constraints, a good idea to look at the kinds of things we have listed because we have them categorized by like input constraints, process constraints, and output constraints. This is like if you think about the creative process as a process, you start with inputs, right? Then you do some shit, and then you have some outputs, right? And you
Right,
can put
right.
constraints on any one of those three things. And so we have like Laura threw in the chat, like budget is a good constraint. It absolutely is, right? You can say as an input to
Yeah.
this process, we're giving it X number of dollars, right? Like that's how, and that could be self-imposed or that could be imposed by the outside world, because it could be that you're a startup and you just only have so much cash, right? Like that can be an input constraint. Like you have these set of activatable, resources. It's the knowledge, it's human capital, it's all those other things that you've got. There's a really good example of this in the real world with Adobe Kickbox. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that or not, but the basic idea, yeah, because I know you like Mark Randall. So Adobe Kickbox is a pretty dope like tool. So Adobe Kickbox, like the whole premise behind it is this idea that we're going to let everybody in our company like try to innovate by putting them through like an afternoon training program. And then they get this box. That's why it's called a Kickbox, right? So like you get this box that has tools in it, and then they get these cards that tell them like, first you do one, then you do this step, and you basically like graduate through these steps along the way, and with benchmarks for how you exit out of there. And one of the things that they put inside this box is they put a $1,000 Visa gift card. And the idea there is that you have $1,000 to spend, right, in the pursuit of the first goals of this box, like just getting customer validation and all of that. And $1,000 is a constraint. And they're not saying that it's not $10, it's not $50, right? But it's not $10,000 either, right? Yeah. It's a constraint that says this is how much we're willing to invest in this idea, to do that kind of thing, which is super, super interesting. But we can also, like, as we go into the process, start saying, like, we're going to use what we call in design thinking, which was our topic last week. We call it time compression. It's this idea that we're going to get 5 minutes to focus on this one little activity. We'll create as many ideas as we can in 5 minutes on sticky notes. And the idea of time compression is that it doesn't give us time to activate our internal critic because we're just coming up with ideas, right? So we can't do that.
You know what? You know what's coming to mind right now when you said internal critic like twice was this experience of writer's block. So you're sitting there. I mean, I feel like we've all experienced that in one form or another. Like, you have to write a paper, or you have to write an email or something like that, and you're sitting there and the cursor's just blinking. Right, and I feel like what's involved there is the inner critic, right? Like that is such an obstacle to forward progress. And I like how you talked about that as being like a natural, healthy thing, part of our human, wiring and that kind of thing. But it's also something that restrains us from moving forward. Okay, so can I go off script for a second?
Oh my.
So there's this person named Alan Watts. And Alan Watts is, he talked a lot about, I think it was in the 70s, right? About like spirituality and he, some Eastern traditions and stuff like that. But anyways, he said one time that I was listening to a talk, he said something like, the mind is a slippery little devil. And what I meant, or why that comes to mind, is when we're talking about this, we're looking at this, there's this inner critic and there's also creativity. And what we have to do as people is balance those two things. Use the critic when it's appropriate. Use like suppression of the critic when it's appropriate. But man, that's really tricky, right? Like it feels to me like it's holding a watermelon seed. Like, how do you do that? You can't squeeze too much, and you can't just let it go, right? Or else it'll slip right out. So balance, right? Like, I don't know. That just was coming up for me while you were talking about design constraints, right? Seemingly counterintuitive, but when we take a step back and we look at it, it's actually two sides of the same coin, isn't it?
Right. Yeah.
And so what we're totally doing with our input and our process and our output constraints is we're just flipping that coin back and forth over and over again to allow that to generate, stuff.
Totally. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. There's Laura dropped in an example of this thing we do at Startup Weekends. Laura's organized a bunch of Startup Weekends, and they're right at the top, right on Friday night. Like the basic premise of Startup Weekend is like everybody gets together on Friday night and you get 60 seconds to pitch a brand new idea to the audience, right? And then the whole audience all votes on the ideas that they're like the best, the most popular ideas, form teams around these brand new ideas. And then they have until Sunday night to turn that idea into a business. It's a fantastic program. Check out startupweekend.org. It's really cool. I highly endorse it.
Oh, by the way, I've been to one, and Josh is a great facilitator.
Too kind, too kind, too kind. But
Just spitting facts. That's all.
well, thank you, sir. So one of the things we do on Friday night to loosen everybody up, right, is this warm up game that we call Half Baked, right? And it's this idea that it's like something that that you do that warms us up, like Laura says, just warms us up by loosening up our muscles, so it relaxes a little bit, loosens our constraints by actually doing some of these very same things. So what we do is we just actually throw in a bunch of constraints on something that's extremely low stakes, because it's a stupid game, right? And so you basically get a bunch of random words, and everybody gets 2 random words, right? And then small teams, it's a little organically random teams, get 5 minutes to turn those 2 words into a business. And it's fake, right? You'll get words like, unicorn burger,
Sunday.
right?
Yeah.
And you'll have to like turn that into a thing. But you get tons of constraints in there. You get the time constraint of 5 minutes. You get the constraint of here are your 2 words that you've got to use, right? You get constraint of an output constraint of here's what you have to have. You have to have a name for the business. You have to have a business that incorporates those 2 words. You have to have a customer and a problem you're solving, right? So we have all these constraints that tell us exactly how to spend that limited amount of time that we have. It's a great example for something like that. And even though, to Laura's point, we're not doing anything with it, right? It gets us ready by forcing us to work in that creative space.
So give me 2
and that
words.
creative space
Josh.
has constraints.
Give me 2 words.
I'm gonna give you 2 words. So one is reading, and the other one is hot dogs.
Reading and hot dogs.
Yes, sir.
All right, so we're supposed to come up with a business idea for that.
Yeah, come up with a business idea that uses those 2 words. You have to have a name for your business. You got to have a customer for your business. You got to have a problem that you're solving, and you have to tell me how you're making money off it.
Damn, now the pressure's on because my inner critic is like, no, that's stupid. That's stupid. Like,
Well, this is
like hot dogs in a library, mobile book bookmobile that only serves hot dogs instead of books.
well, while Dan is flailing to come up with an on-the-spot business idea there,
like
I'm curious about you guys.
It's like a prank service. So like, somebody says, okay, well, hey, we're gonna send a mobile food truck to your place for your event, and instead it's gonna be books.
Mm-hmm.
That sucks.
Yeah, you could do that. That's a thing. I don't know if it's great, but
I think it would be good in politics.
It probably would. I think hot dogs are going to solve all of our political problems. I'm just going to go on record for 2022 and say that the hot dog is going to drop all their problems.
I mean, it is a pretty dope concept.
So I'm curious for our watches here today, for everybody down here, like what are some constraints that you've imposed recently, right? What we've talked about a bunch of different kinds of constraints that we have here. What are some of the constraints that you've dropped in there? And how have those worked for you? Let us know down in the comments. Super interested in what you've got to say on that subject. So let's pivot a little bit, Dan. Let's get practical, right?
Let's do.
You and I can just stay in this like esoteric land of philosophy forever, and that's super fun for us. Maybe a little bit fun for everybody out there, but let's give some advice. Let's give some practical stuff. Let's get some conversation going around. How do you actually go about creating ideas?
Okay.
Right. How do we go about creating ideas? And while Dan's talking about his favorite ideation techniques, I want to hear about yours. So start talking about your favorite ideation techniques in the chat. We'll throw them up on screen. And Dan, what's yours?
Okay. So the biggest thing that I like to do is, first of all, just ask people, hey, what are you having problems with? Because that helps to narrow down like my options, right? And then sometimes, actually a lot of times, I like to just sit there, like literally like that, looking like that. My wife tells me I make that face a lot. Looking at an empty space. And what I'm doing is I'm actually visualizing like, okay, what's the problem? What's that look like? And when I can get settled and my thoughts kind of they naturally just start falling to the bottom, right? And I do get some quiet there. What happens is I'm kind of minding my own business and ideas start to pop in there, which is cool, right? But that's not the only thing that I like to do. Sometimes I'm actually having a hard time coming up with stuff. And when I recognize that that is the case, what I'll do is I'll look at patterns, or I'll look for patterns elsewhere. So if I'm looking at some content, or if I'm looking at like needing to come up with content and I need an outline for something like that, right? I'll think about a book that I read, and I'll think about like, well, how did they organize all this stuff, and how, like, what are some of the things? The same architect that I was talking about earlier said that what he does is he starts flipping through older work and old, like some of the more famous architectural portfolios and stuff like that to get some inspiration. So I found that, one of the really cool things is observing patterns that already exist and then seeing how, what are some of the parallels that I'm thinking about? And usually I find that helps to jar some of that. Just it starts to flow, actually. That's my stuff.
Yeah.
What about your stuff?
No, that makes a lot of sense. I like that. I like that you think about things broadly, right? In terms of systems.
I mean, it's easier, right? Because then I'm just not needing to reinvent the wheel, right? I'm just innovating on it, or I'm just sort of, there's a framework, right? And I like to think about the idea that, well, I maybe have, for example, if I'm looking at a business or startup or I'm solving a problem for somebody or something like that, I know that it's more than likely been solved before, right? Maybe not with this new twist. And so rather than having to think through all of the things, I can just concentrate on this one thing by using the old thing as sort of a template from which I can depart.
Right. It's interesting that you say that too, because one of the constraints that we don't talk about enough as an input constraint is this idea of the question itself is an input constraint. Right? The question that we're asking, the problem that we say that we're solving, the challenge that we say we're approaching is actually a constraint. And that can be really valuable or it can not. And so one of the things that I like to throw in there along the same lines is to figure out first, like, are we even asking the right question? Is there something else we should be asking? So you can take this, if you look at a question and say that you're trying to answer a problem you're trying to ideate around, there are two things you can do to make it bigger or smaller, depending on what feels right. So like, if you
feel like we're going to get a tool here.
We're going to get a what?
We're going to get a tool.
You're going to get a tool. That's right. It's time to drop a tool.
I want a tool. Tell me.
You want to? So the tool is very simple. It's two questions you can ask depending on the problem. So if you're looking at a problem and you start ideating on it and you can't get your fingers into it, right? Because it seems abstract. It's probably maybe not specific enough. So then you can ask a question of how. You could take your problem and say how, and that will force you to come up with something that's narrower. And narrower might be easier to digest, right? So you take this really abstract, vague thing and make it more specific by asking how, right? We want blank how. Oh, and then you get to something and you narrow it in. It might not be the right how, but it starts to narrow it in, and that narrowing it in is going to serve to help you clarify, right?
I can see how that works. So reading and hot dogs, how do we put those together?
Right. You can ask a how question on that. Or if you could say that we want to use reading and hot dogs to solve blank, 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 right? You could say, how is it going to do that? Right? How are we going to use reading and hot dogs to solve politics? And then that starts to open up a different question, right?
I mean, I totally got more ideas when you were saying that.
This is how it works, right? It's a tool that just in a weird way cracks it open by narrowing it. And on the flip side, we end up with this problem of sometimes we're asking the wrong question. This happens all the time in startups, where let's say you started with, how are we going to use hot dogs and reading to fix like politics, right? We're going to fix congressional inaction on our issue of choice through hot dogs, right? And so we might actually be asking the wrong question there, because it might be like I don't know how those work, and so we're not getting any ideas. It's not working.
Maybe the right question would be, well, how are hot dogs made?
That's probably not, but like,
I mean,
it has
go down that path. The same way that Congress works, right?
Yeah. I saw some stoner on the internet, presumably a stoner on the internet, asking one of those like marijuana questions, what I call marijuana questions, right?
Nice.
And the question was about like hot dogs. Now, hot dogs are really just ground meat in an intestinal casing. And so once you eat and start digesting a hot dog, it's still a hot dog, but you're the casing now.
Oh, damn.
Right. So, and I'm sober right now. And now it's like, whoa, that's weird. So anyway, going back to think.
Oh my God, I love that.
If you're
That's
asking
so
a
good.
question that's too narrow, right? You could crack it open another way by asking why.
That's
Why
so
are we
blowing
trying
my
to
mind.
solve the congressional inaction using hot dogs and reading? Like that's going to open up some interesting things that may give us a different kind of question, and I
So,
think like,
okay.
see, it actually did work for Laura because she came up with a perfect solution for all of this. We just need, the hot dog caucus to come in and like start shutting people up. But anyway, so you can ask how or why to like to do that, which I think is great. Laura also dropped in some of her constraints to use. Like, this makes sense. Like, Laura runs the nonprofit Startup Sack here in Sacramento with Jeff Bennett, and like those are all kinds of things that you have to, like, you have limited amount of resources, you have limited amount of staff, right? And like time to execute is one of my favorite ones. And so like we do this thing sometimes with entrepreneurs where they want to get started, they have a grand vision, this big thing they want to do, right? And so like you can't do it now. And they know that, right? It's a big vision. It's their BHAG, right? Their big, hairy, audacious goal, right? They have that BHAG that they want to go after. But it's like, what does that mean for today? What does that mean for tomorrow? What is activatable resources with the money you have, with the skills you have, with the people you know, and in 2 weeks' time? That's it. Those are your constraints, right? And so it's a mixture of input constraints and output constraints. And you say, this is what we're going to do. That's, some fraction base 2, right, of that big vision, but that we can accomplish it now. And that's our right next step,
I like how you explain that. One of the things that comes up, at least with people that I work with, is they're like, hey, I need to start marketing this thing. And that's such a broad question, right? And I say, okay, well, there's like this constraint exercise that I didn't even know that I was doing until today, which it's something called the Bullseye Method. And this isn't Dan's. This is I don't even know if it's Gabriel Weinberg's, but Gabriel Weinberg was the one that put it in front of me. He wrote this book called Traction. And the challenge is this: it's like when you have a thing and you want to stick it out in the marketplace, it's like, how do you start getting traction? Well, if we looked at all the different marketing channels at our disposal and we just started throwing time, money, and effort at all of them, we don't have enough bandwidth to cover all of it. And so he lists out like 19 channels in this book. He wrote this in 2015, right? So there's a couple more that have been added to the mix, I feel, since then. But the idea is that, hey, wait a minute, let's think about how we can use all of these channels, go through that thought exercise, but then only test, like actually legit test, like 6 of them at a time. So small batch testing. And what that does is that imposes like some sort of constraint. Basically, we're saying, okay, well, what can I do right now with what I've got? That's usually what I'll tell folks. And that goes along with that whole have it, like, cut it in half, like progressively, until you can get to a place where you can actually do something. I really like how you explain that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because then you're saying, basically, how do you get from this broad, infinite thing into something that's manageable right now? Like, how do we change that into action?
I feel like that's a big problem for a lot of people, and it's one of those problems that folks don't even know it's a problem. It's so elusive, right? Because here I am. I'm thinking about this vision, right? I want to do a social network, and I want to have like everybody in there, and I want to create social currency through this gamification engine. Like, this is legit something Dan's been thinking about, right? But that's huge. That's a big vision. And you know what? Like, folks tell us all the time, what is that big giant vision that you have? Like, go with that. And I'm like, yeah, that's cool for like North Star stuff, right? But how does that help me do something today? And I don't know. I mean, I feel like when I feel like we're touching on this often overlooked, really important aspect, which is, yeah, we have this giant idea, and it's great and it's awesome. It's going to help out a lot. But how do we actually get there? And well, I feel like we don't do enough having, right? Like, I feel like we don't do enough of that. So we only do it maybe like once or twice. Like, so what's the social network's half? What's half of that? Well, 2 customer segments, right?
And it can be difficult to figure it out, right? Like, even once you do ask the question, like, sometimes it's tough to say, like, what is half of that?
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you think?
That's a broad question. Like, but but I think it can be difficult to figure it out. But there's always a half of something there, right?
Yeah.
So let me start with like a different example. Like, let's say you wanted to operate a restaurant. Let's say you had this big vision for a restaurant that you want to
Mm.
offer, right? And like, opening a restaurant is a risky business, and it has a lot of different components to it, right? You have to have sufficient money because you have to have location, and you have to have staff, and you have to be able to manage staff, right? You have the front of the house, you have the back of the house, you have the menu, you have the stylist, the decor, you have like so much stuff, right? It's like the anxiety, right? You can like you have that, like it's just so big, and you start figuring like what's half of that. Some people might point out like, okay, you could have a restaurant by having a catering business or a food truck or something like that, right? That could be a reasonable way of halving it. But then you want to keep going even further. And you might, if you, as you chop that down, it might be this week, can I
Yeah.
get 10 people over to my house to cook them a meal for money?
You know what?
Right?
I like this, right? Because this is now getting into that portion where when we have this idea and we want to run a test, how do we actually run the test? And that's
Right.
exactly what
Right.
I do. Is okay, well, I can't 3D print a prototype right now. What else could I do? And usually it comes down to, oh, let me just like make something out of that Amazon box and tape it up and maybe throw, I don't know, some different colored construction paper on top of it with a Sharpie, put on the box a button and put
Right.
that in front of somebody. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like, I feel like I feel like we're onto something, Josh. Like that. I
We,
love this whole halving thing and how
yeah.
we actually. Okay, so how do you run a Wizard of Oz test? How do you run a concierge test? All that kind of stuff. How do you do that with what you got? And I really am enjoying this and this whole cut it in half until you can get to something that you can actually execute.
Right. Because
That's great.
it's about finding something that is going to give us data, right?
Yeah.
That's going to say,
Yeah.
are we on
Yeah.
the right track? Right. And so you could start having it. And if you have knowledge, to your point of like those different kinds of experiments that you're mentioning, like, the Wizard of Oz test and the landing page test, like there's a bunch of these things, right? And David Bland's book is great for that if you want to check that out, as well. It's called Testing Business Ideas. It's part of the Strategizer series. There's like 50 something tests that you can run inside there. With a simple knowledge of that test, you can start having it and say, oh, that would look like this. And you know what? I can do this right now. I have the resources to do this right now, and it's going to tell me, am I on the right track? Right.
Yeah, and
So
then what happens, and this is really exciting, sorry. What happens is, okay, once you, like, you put a thing out there, like, and it's ugly, and it doesn't it's gross, right? But it gives you data, and then once you have that data, that becomes a known point. And once you have that known point, that basically replaces some of that, like, guessing foundation, and now it's no longer an assumption.
right.
Now it's something that's actionable. And with more action means, or with more solidified, validated data and less assumptions, that means that I don't know, I get this vision of like I'm floating up to the top of the next step.
Right.
So is taking
Right.
the next step an actual like active thing, or is it, hey, let me look at my constraints, let me perform some halving, let me do what I can with what I've got, find something out, and by virtue of me actually getting emotion and doing those things, even though it looks janky, I actually get somewhere better.
Yeah. I I mean, totally, right? And you're asking the right question of like, it's that idea of getting somewhere better through, right? And then these techniques.
Yeah.
And I want to come back in just a minute to this idea of experiments, right? Because to your point, it's what you do, right? Those early stage experiments are what you do. So I want to come back to that in just a minute, have you talk a little bit more about that. But before we do, I want to go through a couple of more of these like early stage. How do we even come up with an idea in the first place, right? How do we come up with that BHAG from which we want to start having, right?
Okay.
And so I'm gonna go through a few ideas that you can use. I wrote about some of these in a blog post a couple of years ago. I'm gonna drop the link in the chat so that you guys can check that out at your leisure if you want to. But I'm just gonna talk through a couple of these things. So the first one is what is called challenging and inverting assumptions. So this is the idea, like, let's say you're looking at a problem space, and it's one where you want to solve it, but you're not exactly sure how or what the problem is, but maybe the industry is due for a shakeup, right? So the example in the blog post, this is from a couple years ago, but the example I used in the blog post was, maybe we want to do something different in the in-home cleaning space, right? Like maid services. Let's say we want to do something in that space. Maybe we have a lot of context there, we have a lot of experience there, or we're just like thinking like, this is really dated, like we've done the same service forever and we want to do something different. So what you do is you take this idea of in-home cleaning services, of maid services, and you start listing out every single assumption that you have about it, right? And there's dozens, right? Here's a couple. The cleaners come to your house. That's an assumption, right? Another one, they clean for you. Another one, they bring their own supplies. Or they charge by the service that they're performing and by the square footage of the house that they're cleaning, right? So you came up with all these, like you're going to come up with dozens of these types of assumptions. And then the way inverting assumptions works is, and this might be surprising, you invert them, right? That's how inverting assumptions work. And so what you do is then you say, all right, let's take them one by one. So cleaners don't come to your house. Cleaners don't clean for you. They don't bring their own supplies. They don't charge by service and square footage. And each one of those can generate a series of ideas. For example, if the cleaners don't clean for you, what does that mean? Well, maybe they're teaching you how to clean. Maybe this is something that parents hire for their college kids to help them figure out how to maintain a clean house by showing, like, here's how you do this long way, Marie Kondo style, right? Something like that. Or they don't bring, maybe they don't come to your house. Maybe there's a virtual version of that, or they don't bring their own supplies, so they use yours, which is cheaper, right? Or whatever. There's a bunch of ideas that you can generate from that. And most of them won't be viable, but that's okay, because we're about quantity over quality, right?
Can I say something?
Of course.
Okay, so while you're talking about that, there is this startup in Sacramento called Foodum. And Foodum is basically, you hire a chef to come to your house, use the ingredients that you have to actually like create like meal prep and that kind of thing. So, just case in point, just wanted to illustrate that with that case study.
Well, totally, because you could take that, you could arrive at that same kind of interesting idea by taking the restaurant space or the catering space or something like that, and actually like just starting this inversion process, and you might come up with something really interesting about that.
Yeah.
Like you could arrive at the concept of Foodum, which is going through a local accelerator here, and they have funding and stuff like that. Like you could get to that by this, this process. Let's talk about another one. So let's talk about trend triggers. So this is a fun one. So trend triggers, the idea is, this comes from the idea of like Uber for Blake, right? It's taking something that's over here and applying it to your thing over here, right?
Like Uber for hot dogs.
Like Uber for hot dogs is totally one, right? Hopefully not Airbnb for hot dogs, because I really don't like what that implies. But you come up with this problem that you want to solve, and you start looking at trends, right? And there are a bunch of sites. I linked to some in that blog post that I dropped into the chat, but there are a bunch of sites you can go to that have trends listed. And speaking of which, while we're talking about trends, I'm curious, what are some of the trends that you guys see for 2022, right? Like, but you start taking all these trends, like these trends that you're thinking about, and you start applying them to your space. Right. And so monthly subscriptions are a big trend the last few years of like, you have the Dollar Shave Club that sends you a razor. You have the boxes that, like there's the box of awesome, and there's the men's care box, and then there's just all these boxes for kids. That accelerator that I mentioned, Growth Factory here in Sacramento, has a company that's doing a box for kids. Like there's a whole like set of these kinds of things you can come up with, and you just start applying them to this concept. So if we continue with our cleaning example, right, and we talk about like this idea of a subscription service, what if we had a timeshare butler? Right? We take the trend of like the subscription service and apply it to a butler, right? Or something like that. So you can do that, so there's all different kinds of ways you can just start applying trends to problems, and it's just going to generate a bunch of ideas, and then you can start playing around with those,
I like Laura's trend.
That it's just probably not wrong. Like, I mean, we are going to be working from home for a while here. It's going to be there. And also, like, yeah, Laura's right. It's CES in Vegas this week, the Consumer Electronics Show. Like, that's where all the major stuff got distributed. VCRs were announced at consumer electronics shows. Like it's that kind of world-changing stuff. So I'm really curious what's going to be announced this week.
I saw a BMW that had like changing paint on the outside. That was pretty slick. Thanks, Reddit.
That's pretty cool. That's right. So I'm going to do one more ideation technique, and then I want to move on to talk about experiments. But so one more ideation technique is what I call and what. And this is the quickest one. It's the easiest one by far to do to create a bunch of ideas all at once, right? This is where instead of picking a problem space, you pick an industry or something that you want to start in, right? And the example I use in the article is wine. So let's say you're in the wine business and you want to come up with something new in the wine business. Maybe you're a winemaker and you're looking for new ways to sell wine, right? So then you have the first thing. The first thing is wine, right? So now you ask, and what? Right? And so then you start saying, okay, wine and movies, wine and pizza, wine and vacations, wine and motorhomes, right? And you come up with dozens and dozens and dozens of these wine and thing. And each one of those is multiple ideas. So like if we take wine and movies, like when I think about movies, right, I think about movie theaters, and I also think about Netflix, right? So there's a couple of ideas buried into that. What about, if we're talking about wine and Netflix, a subscription service that sends you a bottle of wine each week that's perfectly tailored to a movie on your watch list?
So can I jump in again, please?
Yes, my silence was to indicate your presence.
Okay, my bad.
Hop on in.
All right, so 2020 happened, pandemic, all that kind of stuff, and all of a sudden people had this giant constraint like, hey, we can't go anywhere and see each other, right? So there was this one client that I was working with called the Artisan Poor, and they're still around, still doing business. Shout out to Cynthia. She really inspired me by this. Instead of doing like tasting rooms and all that kind of stuff, then what she did was she started sending bottles of wine to people that would taste together as curated by the actual winemaker. And I was like, oh, that's cool, because you could have a winemaker on the East Coast talking about like, a certain wine with wine drinkers on the West Coast like pretty easily. So that's what came up for me while you were talking about that.
Yeah. It's ideas like that, right? And they can just bubble up and surface,
So awesome.
It's pretty cool. There's tons, just so many different ideas. And I'll throw one little thing, a little visual on the screen here that comes from A Beautiful Constraint, which talks about a lot of this kind of stuff, or at least they used to. And it's the idea of we can if thinking. So you take something that you feel you can't do, like, well, we can't do that. And you encounter this problem and you want to come up with ideas for how to solve the thing that you claim you can't do. So what you do is instead, you start a sentence by saying, we can if, right? And so then there are 6 items around this hexagonal structure here. There's 6 ways to continue that sentence. We can if we remove or substitute blank, right? So could we do it if we removed something? If so, what could we remove? Could we do this if we substituted one thing for another thing, right? And that gives you another constraint that you can apply on. There are 6 different, or actually more than that, because each one of these is a couple of them, but like there's 6+ constraints around this hexagon that allow you to do that.
I was going to say, we were actually using this last week, me and another group that I was working with, in terms of how to implement Zoom security features, right? Given the constraints that you have with a particular community, yeah, can you do all the security measures? No, but we could if. And so we went through this, and it was super helpful. I mean, now we have more ideas to execute on than we actually have time, which is awesome.
Right.
Well, but it got it through that whole thing of like, okay, freedom through constraint, right? Because we said, okay, well, how do we like actually execute this? Well, we could, like, it doesn't seem like it's possible right now, but we could if blah blah blah, So yeah, great.
Totally. Yeah. And so one very last thing is that, like, a lot of the times when we talk about ideation, we think of like these brand new products and services that we're coming up with, just like we did today. Like all of our examples were, let's create something that completely doesn't exist at all, and let's create a company around this thing. Let's create a startup that does blank. But ideation is also something that occurs in the enterprise space too. And it occurs in kind of similar ways. In fact, on the podcast this week, the Inside the Box podcast that I host this week, we talked about one of the ways that companies, established companies, come up with new ideas for market opportunities to pursue. And we're not going to talk about that too much here, but check out the Inside the Box podcast. Our episode this week is all about how to create ideas for new market opportunities inside of an established organization. A lot of these same types of things are going to crop up in there, but we talk about a particular tool, for doing that. But
I mean, how are you gonna like say that and just leave us hanging like that, Josh?
Because I have to. All right. So the basic idea here. Basic idea.
We could leave it. I don't have to know.
Okay. I'm gonna leave it there. I'm just gonna say it's a simple 4-step process that you use to go from here's who we are to here's the next step in a brand new market opportunity that we hadn't thought of before. 4 steps. Talked about in detail on the pod.
Color me intrigued.
Well, I look forward to your feedback on the episode, man. Shoot me the notes, and that goes for everybody out there as well.
That sounds cool. Okay.
So let's spend the next few minutes. I wanted to come back to this idea of experimentation, Dan, right? We talked about how, a lot of this stuff is getting to a thing that we then, just an idea that we have to make real. And I think part of the reason that we say that is because I think you and I just know intuitively and from our experience that maybe a lot of people don't know that ideas are worthless.
Right.
They're freaking worthless.
I got a whole whiteboard from them. And I haven't made a damn cent from any of them.
Right. If ideas, right, were valuable, there'd be a place on the internet you could go to just buy ideas. Right. But there's a marketplace for everything. There's a marketplace on the internet where you can buy items made from moose turd.
Also, again, color me intrigued.
If you're curious, it's called Turdy Works. If you just Google that, there's a hilarious local news video on it from a few years ago. But you can buy items made from moose turds on the internet. Anything that's of value to anyone is there. And there's no place on the internet where you can go to just buy ideas because they're worthless. People think that their ideas are inherently valuable, but your ideas are inherently not valuable. But you are valuable, and your execution is valuable. And that execution piece comes in the form of experimenting. So Dan,
earlier we were talking about Adobe Kickbox, right? And one of those items in that box is a little notebook that says bad ideas. And there's not a notebook that says good ideas, because Mark Randall says that all ideas are bad.
Mm-hmm. It's true. There's no such thing as a good idea.
He takes it one step further, and he says ideas are like these little demons that, if granted the opportunity to grow, will steal like hundreds of thousands of dollars from you and time off your life. Kind of going in the other direction, right? Not to be like macabre or anything, but it's like so true, right? Like if when Dan, because I've done this myself, I put too much stake or I've attached too much importance to what I think is a thing, then if I'm not careful, that can actually end up like sending me off on this other crazy path that eventually leads me back to square one.
Right. Exactly. So let's spend a couple minutes. Let's talk about experiments, right? What do we actually mean by experiments?
You asking me?
I am asking you.
I'm
also asking our folks at home, like, what are some experiments you run? Like, what do you guys do with that? I'm curious about it. But like you talked about earlier, like this idea of experiments, and that's what you do. Like, why is that necessary? Why do you have to do that? What does that look like? Right.
Well,
we have all these ideas. We said that they're worthless. We're kind of implying that the next step is an experiment, right? Take it from there.
Well, okay, so an experiment is basically like, hey, is this actually going to work? And I found that it's actually kind of an art form. Is like, well, what do I need to prove out? And we talked about cutting things in half before, and I've kind of like through my own trial and error have discovered that, well, maybe I need to have what I think is a valid experiment result. So what I mean by this is, Okay, so let me just give you an example on the technical side. So I was working on this project where I needed this, basically what it was going to be, it was a hardware thing, where I had a bunch of Arduino. The Arduino was the controller, the little computer that told the lights what to do, and there was a string of lights, right? And I needed the string of lights to do something in a certain pattern. And before I actually like decided that number one, it was going to be able to happen, I had a thought that maybe it would, yeah, because I saw like other examples of it. But I didn't know how to implement that myself. And so what I did is I said, okay, let me just start small. Let me start with like 10 LEDs that I didn't have to do anything with. I just stuck them there. And let me see if I can get them to go off in the pattern that I want. And it took a little bit of work to get there. Because Dan, I'm pretty bad at programming. I'm okay admitting that. That's totally cool. But the idea was I wanted to challenge myself and get there anyways. So I did my best, and basically I got it to where if I push the button, the lights would go in a circle. But it took a long time for me to get there because of the bad programming thing, right? And at that point, I wasn't too savvy on asking others for help. That's another thing, another discussion later. But the idea was that I needed to start really, really small, get a provable result so I can move on to the next bigger thing. So experiment for me is all about like, okay, what is that thing that will be a project killer, a startup killer? And how do I prove that it won't be? Or how do I validate that I'm on the right track? That if I continue to do things in this along this particular trajectory, then I'll probably get somewhere that's workable. So an experiment for me is, if I wanted to like summarize that, it's like, let me see if I'm right about this. Oh, can't hear you.
So
There you go.
we unmuted me at the same time and
We
muted
did.
me again.
We
So
did.
yeah, it's the remote thing, right? This is just part of life now. I just really want that tool in person. Right? I want to be able to like, nope, mute. That's really what I'm after in the real world.
I think we could all benefit from that.
So,
oh wait, it's a hot dog, bro.
That's right. Laura told us we just shove a hot dog in their mouth, right? Yeah. So let me see if I can. I want to like
No
briefly
lawsuits
summarize
there.
what I just heard you say, right? So you're saying like we take this idea and we surface a bunch of assumptions from that idea, right?
Mhm.
And then we find which of those assumptions is most detrimental to us. And then we take, okay, this is the thing we want to design an experiment around, right? That's our riskiest assumption. And we take our
Yeah.
riskiest assumption and we design an experiment, a test, right? And a test has an hypothesis, and it is it's precise, it's discrete, and we know what success looks like, right? And then we do an experiment that is deciding that is intended to help us learn whether or not that risky assumption is true or false. Is that right?
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. And to me, it sounds like, wait a minute, that's more constraint, Josh. But
Hey, yes, it is.
but it's, I mean, not to be cliche or anything, but what that does, it allows me to like with assurance take the next step. And for
Right.
me, like, hey, I'm 45 now. So how many more years do I have left? Probably my wife will tell you that I'm crazy if I say another 45. But screw it, I'm gonna say that. It's gonna
I
be at
think you
least
got
another
45 in
45.
you, Dan.
Look, I don't even have gray yet. Actually, you
The,
just can't
the
see it.
world deserves another 45 years of you.
Well, I don't know about that.
I didn't say why.
Okay.
2021 was a terrible year. We deserve it, right?
So like I have a limited amount of time, right? So I need to save where I can, and doing experiments is going to help me do that, right? Like, and it's not even time I have left. Maybe it's give a shit, right? Like I only have 6 months to give a shit about this particular project or this particular mission that I'm on. And I need to make sure that I can move through these questions quickly so that I can actually get to the next step, so
Right.
that I can continue. So I don't run out of give a shit before I actually like finish the project, right?
Right. And you know what? I can't think of a better place to end than on that note.
Nice.
And in the spirit of starting on time and ending on time, we're going to kind of call it there. So if you guys are watching out there, smash that like button. Let us know that you liked it, and hit subscribe and tap the little bell so that you can be notified of our upcoming episodes. We really appreciate it. We loved hanging out with you guys today. Our next live show, because we are here every single Friday at 11 a.m., is on January 14th. So hop on and join us here. Really looking forward to seeing you guys again next week. And if you have any ideas for feedback or suggestions on topics that you want to see, as always, you can reach us at shoptalk@rightbox.co, and we read all the messages that we get. So
Also want to do a shout out to Laura. Thanks for coming on the show today. Thanks for attending and participating.
Yes, absolutely. We appreciate every single one of you. Hello, Laura. Hello, everyone else. And for Laura, because she asked in the chat how old I am 36.
Oh, damn.
Yes, I turned 36 last month, so I'm still the baby in here. All right,
you're on your prime.
I'm in my prime. All right. Well, we like you too. We like you too, Laura. So that's it. That's all we have time for today. Thank you so much, and we will see you guys next week on Startup Shop Talk. Bye-bye.